All right, welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're unpacking a case that is absolutely fascinating and honestly pretty terrifying. It's the story of Trista. She was this brilliant, high-achieving perfectionist who literally lost her ability to care. It's a journey that starts out as a bizarre medical mystery, but it quickly spirals into some of the deepest philosophical questions we have about human consciousness and how we actually survive our own minds.
So let's just jump right in. What happens when your brain decides to protect you by erasing your emotions? Because this isn't just a story about being physically sick. We're looking at what happens when the human mind actively hides from its own reality. It starts with a kid having these totally unexplained physical symptoms, and it ends with this massive realization about human nature. Keep that question in your head as we go through this. What if your brain erased your feelings just to keep you safe?
Just looking at her medical journey, it's wild. At age 9, Trista starts getting these sharp chest pains, shortness of breath, some moderate compulsions, and she didn't tell her parents. She thought it was normal, or maybe she was just under too much pressure. By 11, it gets worse. She's breaking down crying because her throat feels like it's bulging and she can't breathe. And the doctors, they basically dismissed it, said it was acid reflux, maybe stress. They threw some H2 blockers and antacids at her, later some anti-anxiety meds. And it worked, just enough to be ignored. Then, moving into her teens and 20s, Trista completely transformed. She became this hyper-rational machine, writing brilliant papers on causal inference. But underneath all that capability, a total, silent emotional numbness had just completely taken over.
There's this one line from the source text that just hits the nail on the head. She didn't even notice her own numbness. The numbness took the hurt of the numbness away. I mean, wow. For Trista, life just went completely flat. Mondays felt exactly like Fridays. Summer felt like winter. Everything was just clinical observation, no spirit, no essence. It created this absolutely perfect illusion of calm, but the reality was she was totally disconnected from her own humanity.
But that kind of illusion, it never holds up. In her mid-20s, that internal silence just shattered. The physical symptoms from when she was a kid came back, and they came back with a vengeance. Twitches, aches, her whole nervous system just collapsed. For over a year, she was totally dysfunctional, basically a hollowed-out shell of her former self. Imagine sitting in a neurologist's office after a year of this, desperate to know what is actually destroying your mind.
Well, get ready, because the answer is literally straight out of a biological horror movie. It was a slow-acting parasite. An actual worm had been living in and feeding on her neurological pathways since childhood. And the craziest thing about parasites like this is how incredibly patient they are. They don't just attack, they integrate. They spend decades slowly eroding the parts of the brain that handle thoughts, memories, and feelings. Her neurologist told her that because of this organism, her brain's main job wasn't understanding the world anymore, it was forgetting. The parasite was literally eating her awareness of her own awareness.
This brings us to a really fascinating concept, the awareness paradox. Because while this parasite was doing its damage, Trista's brain was actively hiding it from her consciousness. It was a desperate act of self-preservation. Her mind simply refused to acknowledge this massive biological trauma, so her brain basically teamed up with her body. It let her body scream out all the warnings, the chest pains, the twitches, that her conscious mind just couldn't process anymore.
Now here is where things get really deep, because Trista's literal brainworm is actually a perfect mirror for a much broader and frankly terrifying psychological concept. The author brings in the 20th century Norwegian philosopher Peter Wessel Zapffe. Zapffe argued that we actually all carry a version of this parasite, but for us, it's a psychological invader. He basically said, human consciousness is an evolutionary mistake. It's this massive overcorrection that gives us way too much awareness, and we have absolutely no idea what to do with it.
Zapffe had this brilliant, if kind of dark, metaphor for it. He said, like the Irish elk, whose massive antlers grew so heavy they made survival impossible, our consciousness reveals to us the horrors of our own condition. So our highly evolved awareness? It's a double-edged sword. It just makes us painfully sensitive to suffering, to getting older, to the fact that a lot of what we do might be futile. We are literally too aware for our own good.
So how do we cope, right? How do we endure existence without just collapsing under the weight of our own minds? Zapffe said we have to shave down our antlers. We do it using 4 main coping mechanisms: isolation, anchoring, distraction, and sublimation. These are the tools we use to artificially shrink our consciousness down to a manageable size, just so we can get out of bed in the morning.
If we apply Zaffy's lens to Trista, her hyper-rationality makes total sense. It wasn't just a quirky personality trait. It was her very specific way of isolating and distracting herself. By reducing everything to statistical models and clinical solutions, she was hiding. The text puts it perfectly. It was like a kid changing the channel to cartoons so they don't have to watch the news. She chased these menial, logical goals to avoid the terrifying reality of being human, basically pretending she was a machine.
But look, it's not just Trista. We all do this. We use Zappa's anchoring all the time. We anchor ourselves to God, to the state, to climbing the corporate ladder. We're desperate for these things to give us a roadmap for a future we can't possibly predict. But the tragic irony is, while we're so busy surviving, we turn ourselves into little bolts in this giant societal machine. We get totally obsessed with output and production, and eventually, we completely forget we ever had any real internal depth to begin with.
Okay, bringing it back to Trista's physical reality, she did eventually have surgery to get the parasite removed. But it wasn't like she just woke up perfectly fine. The text says she awoke to a landscape of ruins. The memories and feelings that the worm ate, they were just gone forever. She faced this incredibly grueling road of having to relearn how to pay attention to her body and to her thoughts. For the first time in her life, she was crying almost every day, finally realizing just how far away she had drifted from her own mind.
But through all that pain, Trista arrived at this incredibly beautiful realization. She used to think she was so calm and rational, but really, she'd just been robbed of the ability to care. She finally understood that you can't just math your way out of human emotion. Harmony does not come from the clinical reduction of our feelings, but from expressed sincerity and mutual respect for one's own internal life. You are complex, sea and land, sun and moon. You have to respect that. Which leads us to this super empowering takeaway. The hidden truth is that we make the world, and we can choose to make it differently. Sure, we're always kind of on the brink, right? But optimism and hope, they aren't just fluffy feel-good philosophies. They are literal weapons. They are tools that we can intentionally sharpen when we need to survive. We can evolve not because we aren't afraid, but in spite of our fear. Because ultimately, real generosity toward the future lies in giving everything to the present. If we choose to keep going, to evolve, we actually can manage that massive weight we carry around in our heads. We do it by fully embracing the terrifying, beautiful human condition. We take the pain of existence and we transmute it into wonder and into creativity. So, as we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with a question to chew on. In your own life, how are you shaving down your antlers? What anchors and distractions are you using right now to avoid the full weight of your own consciousness? It's something we all have to grapple with. If you enjoyed unpacking these crazy paradoxes of the human mind with me, you absolutely need to check out the author's books linked down in the description. They are totally mind-bending and designed to change the way you think. Thanks for hanging out with me on this deep dive, and I'll catch you in the next explainer.